It's ClandesTime.
Hello everyone, and welcome back to ClandesTime. I am Tom Secker, coming to you from the grassy knolls of North Yorkshire, and this is episode 77, Phil Strub, Pentagon Entertainment Liaison. Phil Strub is the DOD's main man in Hollywood. Long-term listeners and readers and anyone familiar with this topic will know his name, and whether you know it or not, all of you will have seen a film that in some way involved Strub and the entertainment liaison offices that he oversees. Perhaps unsurprisingly, it is not easy to find out biographical information about him. I'm not suggesting there's anything untoward. I think Strub is who he says he is, but it is difficult to find out who he says he is. I know more about the biographies of some spies, and I mean people who are still alive and possibly still active, than I do about Phil Strub. Nonetheless, he is the main man, he's been there a long time, and under his watch the entertainment liaison offices have expanded. But we should start with some background, just to make sure we're all on the same page. The Department of Defense has had some kind of relationship with Hollywood since the 1910s, for literally a century at this point. This was done on a reactive basis, as best as I can tell, until World War II, when the number of films increased, and the nature of the Pentagon's involvement developed significantly. The most overt example was the first motion picture unit of the US Army Air Forces, who actually had a studio in Hollywood and recruited numerous big names, including Ronald Reagan. This was one of several units. The Navy and the OSS had their own film crews producing training videos and just documenting the war. In the immediate post-war period, in between the end of the war and the formal establishment of the Department of Defense in 1947, the Pentagon's involvement drops down to pre-war levels. In 1947, they appointed Donald Baruch as their first entertainment liaison officer. He had served in the Army Air Force Office of Public Information in Washington, and continued as a He had served in the Army Air Force's Office of Public Information in Washington, and continued as a consultant to them after the war. Baruch was appointed a special assistant to the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Public Affairs, and remained in the job for 40 years. Think about that. In theory, Baruch and now Strub are civil servants, of a sort. They work, or worked, under the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Public Affairs, and are, at least on paper, subject to their authority. However, Baruch worked with and outlasted over 20 such men, so he must have had a much more powerful influence on the entertainment industry than they ever did. People are often focused too much on the political appointees, and not on the people who will be there long after any of this current nonsense has been forgotten. Baruch is such a man. Strub is turning into such a man. Baruch lasted 40 years before retiring in 1987. In 1989, Strub was appointed his long-term successor, and has seen at least 15 Assistant Secretaries of Defense come and go. He and his team have worked on around 100 movies since then. For a little more on why Strub got chosen, the history of the DOD in helping to create blockbusters, and how this process works, we'll turn to an interview with Strub on the Kojo Nnamdi Show. I played a clip from this radio show about the science and entertainment exchange on a recent episode, but this is from 2012, and this time it was Kojo himself who was presenting.
It's worth mentioning that this is not a relationship that started recently with films like Under Siege or Black Hawk Down. It goes all the way back to films like Wings, which was made in 1927. What is your own sense of the history involved in this relationship?
Well, we think that the picture Wings was a real milestone. There's probably historical examples of cooperation prior to Wings, but that certainly was a major milestone. And all you have to do is look at the title sequence, and you'll notice right away that the film couldn't have been made without the Army. They're Army aircraft, Army installations used to recreate training and combat from World War I. And if I understand correctly, the picture was an enormous success critically and commercially, and attributed to the fact that they got this kind of cooperation from the military. So you might say that in one respect, if it wasn't the earliest example, it certainly was the earliest important example of the paradigm that pretty much exists today as it did back then.
It's my understanding that you are one, essentially, of only two people to ever hold this position at the Pentagon. Tell us a little bit about your background.
Well, I should say that my alleged career leading to this was by no means planned. It's sort of a happenstance. And my predecessor, Mr. Donald Baruch, was the first incumbent, and he was hired into that job when the department became a separate department in 1947 and held it for 40 years. I have no intention of trying to match his record, but he a gentlemanly sort of chap. I met him. I knew him not well, but I knew him for several years. And when he retired, they advertised his job, and like many other people, I applied for it and happened to be competitive. I had no idea I'd ever be doing this. It was kind of a surprise, but
you were competitive for a couple of reasons. One of them was that you served apparently in the Navy as a ship driver in Vietnam.
I did. That's true.
The other is that you went to USC, University of Southern California Film School.
I did, yes.
So tell us a little bit about what kinds of projects you worked on when you were pursuing a film career.
Well, it was while I was on active duty in the Navy that I decided to try to make a career in the film business, and in particular, I was really interested, even as a young man, in still photography, and I was a great admirer of movie cinematography, and I had studied art history, and I just felt that the visual world was where I could make a contribution. So when I went to USC, that was my intention, to become a movie director of photography, and I really pursued that pretty avidly. I eventually became the advanced camera and lighting teaching assistant, for example. And then I would hang out with directors of photography if they filmed on campus, and I would volunteer to help with student films. But I was lured away from that after about a year and a half, and I never went back to it, really.
800-433-8850 is the number to call. We're talking with Phil Strub. He is Director of Entertainment Media at the Department of Defense, often referred to as the military's Hollywood Liaison. Let's look at the process here. If I'm a filmmaker and I'm working on a project, what are the steps that I have to take if I want to do something like film a naval battle in the San Diego area? I want access to the naval facility there.
Well, I should digress for a moment and mention that this is very much a team effort. Each of the military services, including the Coast Guard, maintains a small satellite public affairs office in Los Angeles, in West LA, in fact. And so when filmmakers contact either those offices or my office first, one of the first things we ask is which service or services does this film portray? And often the military portrayal is vague, or it's not. You can't determine whether or not it's one service or another, or it portrays the Secretary of Defense or the Pentagon. And those would probably come to my office first, but they can go either way, and we work these as a team. So therefore, if there's a picture that involves the Navy or the Army, I'll be sure to let them know. We talk about these projects day in and day out. We have a very close relationship, and we work these things together. So the first thing we ask filmmakers is, send us a script, not just the pages that have military portrayal, but the whole script, and also send us what it is that you want from us and when you'd like to get it.
What are the criteria you use for determining whether you'll work with a project? More specifically, what are the things that would give you the reason to say no?
Well, our criteria is very broad. Basically, we are looking for an opportunity to better inform the public about the U.S. military, and also, as a byproduct, perhaps help military recruiting and retention. But obviously, these are very broad criteria. So there's a lot of subjectivity in determining just how those are met.
If you have an objection to a script, do you simply turn it down, or do you ask the producers, the writers, to change it?
Well, I think that depends, but most of the time we're trying to find a way to work on something. So that would be that would be one of our first questions. Would be, are you up for negotiations? I mean, how locked into this premise or how locked into these characters or this plot are you? And if they say, well, it's pretty much carved in stone, there's really not much we can do with it, and there's some problem areas that are fundamental showstopper, then it's hard to go from there. I mean, if the military is trying to take over the White House, there's not much point in saying, I think you have the rank, in the wrong place. So that's kind of how it starts. Most filmmakers are willing to sit down and negotiate with us, and it's often a process of accommodation. We have to give up something, they might have to give up something. But we try to provide suggestions to increase military realism that interferes minimally to character and to plot.
I love this interview because it's very revealing. Strub served in Vietnam, and then, some years later, after a not particularly successful attempt to get into the film business and being educated at USC, he was appointed Baruch's replacement. Though he doesn't mention this, at the same time that Strub was appointed, the DOD updated their instruction 541016, DOD Assistance to Non-Government Entertainment-Oriented Motion Picture, Television and Video Productions. That helped formalize the process Strub is talking about here. Notice as well that Strub is always downplaying the scale of this, saying that they just have a small satellite office in Los Angeles and that they try to make only minimal changes to scripts. Well, the offices at 10880 Wilshire Boulevard may not be enormous in terms of physical space, but it's enough for them to be working on several major movies and dozens of TV shows at once. That's a lot more than any corporate sponsor or any other government agency. When Aaron and Adam, the intrepid investigative duo from Themes and Memes, actually went down there and had a poke around, they found that it was not easy to find these offices within the building. As to the scale of script changes, this can be minor, this can be major. Sometimes it's as simple as changing the name of a character because in real life they were a child-raping bastard. Other times it's about removing shots and scenes entirely, such as the soldiers using their bayonets to prise gold teeth from the mouths of dead Japanese soldiers. Dialogue has been changed, characters have been made more prominent for propaganda purposes, and as we saw with Clear and Present Danger, the film was rewritten over several months to help it qualify for DOD approval and production assistance. During the production of the first Iron Man film, there was a bit of a falling out. At one point in the script, a military character tells another that people would kill themselves for the opportunities he has. Phil Strub did not like this line. Presumably even a flippant, exaggerating reference to suicide is not considered appropriate. Strub wanted this changed. The director, Jon Favreau, wanted to keep it in, and this argument went on for a while. According to an interview with Strub, it never got resolved until we were in the middle of filming. Now we're on the flight lines at Edwards Air Force Base, California, and there's 200 people, and the director and I are having an argument about this. He's getting redder and redder in the face, and I'm getting just as annoyed. It was pretty awkward, and then he said, angrily, "Well, how about they'd walk over hot coals?" And I said, "Fine." He was so surprised it was that easy. One might say he was surprised it was that easy. I'm wondering why Strub was so insistent that it led to an argument on set in front of 200 people. Along similar lines, if these script changes are so minor and irrelevant, then why are the pre-2002 records of this kept in a private archive at Georgetown, controlled by a friendly academic, and why are the newer ones all but impossible to get hold of? Why do the reports from the entertainment liaison offices make it clear that script changes are still being requested and still being made, but never describe what these changes are in any detail or depth? Indeed, they hardly ever describe them at all. Slightly later on in the Kojo Nnamdi interview, Phil Strub continues to downplay the importance of what he does, specifically with regard to script changes.
Where do you draw the line, Phil, between providing technical advice when it comes to a script or stuff like, this pilot wouldn't have made that kind of maneuver, or asking for scripts to be changed because they simply don't portray the military in a favorable light. And some would argue that that might constitute censorship.
Well, back to your question about technical advice, I think we regard that as a kind of a public service that we would provide, whether or not they're asking for support or whether or not we intend to provide any or even imagine that we might. Of course, that would depend on who's submitting the script. We don't have a large staff, and we don't have enough personnel to provide technical advice for people who are just writing a spec script, unless they have a record of script writing. And as far as where we draw the line, people have asked about that before, and they've asked, is the bar set too high? Is the bar set too low? And our answer is the bar moves up and down. We don't have a fixed kind of a chart that we go to that will tell us whether something will meet our criteria for support or not. It depends very much on the genre. Obviously, we're not going to look at a script that's like a Transformers script or even Eagle Eye in the same way that we're going to look at a script like We Were Soldiers or Black Hawk Down. And so there is no easy answer as far as, where is the dividing line. It all depends on that particular script. And the thing is that, you'll have filmmakers, there's a long list of filmmakers, studios, and networks who have mixed results with us. That's the norm. We work on this project, we don't work on that one, and they come back. As far as whether we exercise any kind of coercive effect on the filmmakers, first of all, it's hard to imagine an industry least vulnerable to coercion than Hollywood. But other than that, there's a whole long list of pictures and TV shows and everything else that was made completely without any Department of Defense involvement.
There are two specific examples that illustrate this minimizing tactic of Strub's very well. In an email to Matt Alford, he denied that the DOD had any involvement in the James Bond film Tomorrow Never Dies. This is absurd, since there is documentation cited in David Robb's books saying that the DOD had a joke about the US losing the Vietnam War removed from the script. This would not have happened if the filmmakers didn't want something from the DOD in return. In fact, if we dig just a little, we find a whole load of evidence of full DOD cooperation in the movie. If we look at the credits for the film, we see that the Department of Defense are listed, as is Phil Strub himself, along with a DOD project officer, Charles E. Davis, the specific person who goes along to make sure that the agreed script is the one that's used when they shoot the film. The credits also list an Air Force technical advisor, Colonel Bruce L. Gilman. A little further down, and the credits also thank the US Department of Defense and the US Air Force, the Ministry of Defense in London, the Directorate of Public Relations for the Royal Navy, HMS Westminster, HMS Dryad, US Air Forces in Europe, US Air Force Special Operations Command, the 48th Fighter Wing at RAF Lakenheath, the 100th Air Refueling Wing at RAF Mildenhall, and the 352nd Special Operations Group at RAF Mildenhall. The Air Force Hollywood website, which has only been working intermittently in recent months, includes Tomorrow Never Dies among their credits, saying that they provided location filming at RAF Lakenheath and RAF Mildenhall in the UK, MC-130s and HH-53 aircraft, Air Force personnel utilised as extras, and security forces. I really can't see how there is any doubt that Strub is either lying or being outrageously absent-minded in denying that the Pentagon fully cooperated with Tomorrow Never Dies, but there you go. His attempts to downplay what the entertainment liaison offices do seems to extend to lying to an academic. A similar thing happened with the Avengers, which Strub has repeatedly and widely stated the DOD either withdrew from or denied some cooperation to because of the storyline. I'll let Phil explain in his own words, before proving how those words are a load of bollocks.
We got an email from Mike in Fairfax who said, there seems to be a lot of advanced military technology in the Transformers movie series. Can your guest comment on the extent to which the Pentagon collaborated on those movies? The Pentagon did work with the Transformers films, which were about alien robots that changed into things like cars and planes, but you halted your cooperation with the superhero film The Avengers because you found it too unrealistic. What was your basis for making that call?
Oh, well, I know that it's a bit ridiculous to be talking about realism when we're talking about superheroes and giant robots from outer space, and we do find it a bit ironic from time to time when we're saying, now, we wouldn't confront this type of foe this way, we would do it that way, and then you realize, well, we don't exactly have battle plans on the shelf that we can pull down that cover that sort of scenario. So it is a kind of a difficult world to be in when you're trying to maintain some kind of realism in an unrealistic context. But we focus on how the military people, how the individual men and women react to each other, relate to each other, interact with each other. That's our principal focus, is how realistic is that? Do they conform to the men and women that we're familiar with? And I think, and organizationally, I think the difference between the Transformers picture and the Avengers one that we didn't even anticipate. We had lengthy discussions with our counterparts in Marvel, and we worked on the two Iron Man pictures. We have a good relationship. But it came down to the relationship between the U.S. military and the SHIELD organization, which just, with its all-powerful international capabilities and weaponry that far exceeded our own, that we just couldn't figure out a way to dovetail those two. It just wasn't workable. So that was where we fell out with the Avengers picture. We did provide a modest amount of support at the end with some Army National Guard troops, but you're right, it's just one of those things that just couldn't come together.
Once more, Strub is minimizing the role of the Pentagon, saying that because SHIELD is an international organization above and beyond the Pentagon, they couldn't find a way to support the film apart from a few soldiers at the end. But the Army's Entertainment Liaison Office reports show that they also gave permission for filming at White Sands Missile Range. They also contain no suggestion of any such falling out with the filmmakers. Furthermore, the film features both F-22 Raptors and F-35 Joint Strike Fighters on SHIELD's massive helicarrier/Nazi airship. The F-35 at this point was not actually being used in live missions. They were still in the testing phase. But sure enough, those planes do appear in the film. So we have three different kinds of support, providing a filming location, vehicles, and soldiers as extras. There isn't that much more that the Pentagon could have provided. Which begs the question, was it the other way round? Did the Pentagon sense that The Avengers was going to be a huge movie, which it was, and wanted to be more involved, but they couldn't come up with a way to gain a more prominent role in the film? It is curious that Marvel have basically said nothing about this supposed falling out, and the Pentagon are credited on the second Captain America film 2 years after The Avengers. Indeed, the question of the F-35s is quite amusing, because the Pentagon made a bit of a splash about debuting them in Man of Steel, which came out the year after The Avengers. They keep trying to pretend like that didn't really happen, that those aircraft didn't really appear in that movie. In a Wired article about all this, they say that the fighters were digitally inserted by the studio, Strub explains, not actual planes provided by the US military. This is not just a ridiculous equivocation. It shows that Strub is suffering from hyperreality, the inability to distinguish the real from the simulated. After all, in most films, most of the time, that sort of vehicle are created digitally. The floating airship is CGI, so obviously the planes on the deck of the airship are CGI. The planes being digital still requires the filmmakers to have had access to real planes, or at least detailed photographs or video of real planes, in order to replicate them accurately. Just like in Transformers, a film that Strub wholly admits the DOD cooperation on, the planes fighting the Decepticons are not real planes. So there's no meaningful distinction between Transformers and the Avengers, except that Strub is clearly trying to distance the Pentagon from the Avengers. Distinguishing between digital planes in one film and digital planes in another, as though one is more real and thus evidence of Pentagon involvement, is downright bizarre. Moving on. It would take too long to list the 100-plus movies that the DOD has worked on since Phil Strub took the job as Hollywood liaison, so I'll direct you to the fullest list that we have. And one thing that jumps out at me is that there are very few films based on real-life events. Aside from Black Hawk Down, United 93, Flags of Our Fathers, and Captain Phillips, I'm struggling to spot any, by comparison to the World War II movies that dominated Don Baruch's time as DOD Hollywood liaison. The reason for this is probably that the Vietnam War doesn't really lend itself to propaganda. It is hard to convince people that Vietnam was a noble war fought by brave American heroes, because it wasn't, and most people already realize that. The sensitivity over one little joke about the US losing Vietnam shows that this is something of a sore spot in the DOD, and ditto Iraq. Instead, we get a fair number of fictional battles, like in True Lies, Clear and Present Danger, and Rules of Engagement, and a lot of disaster movies. Films like Armageddon and Twister and The Day After Tomorrow still present the image of a threatening world that we need protecting from, so they fulfill the psychological requirements of the Pentagon without actually featuring the DOD on screen. Similarly, monster movies like King Kong and Jurassic Park 3, and post-apocalyptic movies like I Am Legend. There are quite a lot of UFO and extraterrestrial films. The remake of The Day the Earth Stood Still, Sphere, Contact, Battle Los Angeles and Battle of Los Angeles, the Transformers films, Battleship, Pacific Rim. These days, the DOD are full-on with UFO movies and extraterrestrial movies, whereas in the past they largely avoided them. For example, Spielberg approached them about Close Encounters of the Third Kind, but the Pentagon didn't want to be involved. As we discussed in a previous episode on Disney, the Air Force helped to make Moon Pilot, which features an alien character, but they were unhappy with the film. Of course, we also have the Marvel Cinematic Universe, where the DOD worked on Iron Man 1 and 2, Captain America the First Avenger, and the Avengers, and an ex-Navy SEAL worked on Thor. So that's almost the entire first phase of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Then there was some sort of falling out on the Avengers, which I think was when the producers of the MCU realized that they didn't need the Pentagon as much as the Pentagon needed them. So the Pentagon put it out like they rejected the producers, like when someone gets dumped and feels heartbroken and so goes around telling everyone that they dumped the other person. The DOD has even denied that they had any involvement in the Avengers in a recent letter to me, which is total bullshit. Noticeably, Phase 2 of the Marvel Cinematic Universe has involved the Pentagon in a very limited way on Iron Man 3, and they are credited on Captain America Winter Soldier, but I don't know the details. Indeed, NASA are now the most prominent name. They are credited on Winter Soldier, Guardians of the Galaxy, and Age of Ultron. Likewise, Ant-Man was supported by the Science and Entertainment Exchange. So the world's biggest film franchise continues to be state-sponsored and state-supported, but much less by the Pentagon than in the first phase. In going through the reports from the entertainment liaison offices, the other major theme that jumps out is transhumanism, which permeates lots of films and TV shows that the Pentagon supports. Phil Strub clearly has no problem with transhuman philosophy. His bosses, whoever they are, have no problem with it either. If anything, one could make the argument that the Pentagon is doing more than anyone else to promote these sorts of ideas. And with the documents now in our possession, I think you could make that argument quite successfully. Everything from Transformers to Terminators, everything from robots to aliens to superheroes to robot-alien superheroes, feature heavily and prominently in these films and TV series. So, while Phil Strub says that they don't have hard written rules for how they go about working with the entertainment industry, and that may be true, there is a worldview that consistently appears in Pentagon-assisted productions. That worldview is fundamentally one of a threatening world, a world that is somehow not enough on its own, and likewise where the humans in it are not enough on their own. Whether it's tidal waves, plagues, giant alien robots, the world is threatening, and you on your own are going to get trampled. So thank fuck for the US military, who, whether by implication or actually on the screen, are going to protect us from all of these threats. That's it. at the core. There is some other stuff about how technological advancement is the major means for the Pentagon to protect us from the threatening world and so on. But that worldview is the most identifiable consequence of Phil Strub's involvement, and the Pentagon's involvement, in the entertainment industry. And we'll wrap things up there. I hope this episode was informative and gave you a sense of who Phil Strub is and why he is important. He's another one of these figures who very few people know his name outside of the industry itself, but he's been around for decades having an influence. So if you found this episode useful and revealing, then please share it around. More people need to realise that the entertainment industry is not what they think it is. So if you can think of anyone who might be receptive to this sort of information, then please send it to them. As per usual, I'll encourage you all to check into my site, spyculture.com, where you can read my articles, document posts, and get other episodes of this podcast. You can subscribe to this show via RSS and email, iTunes, Stitcher, and subscribe to the site too if you want to get all of my work, both this podcast and my other stuff. You can also follow me on Facebook and Google+ and WordPress, and all the options are at spyculture.com/subscribe. I am still making changes to the site and have a few more things in mind before I'm going to leave that alone and focus on research and content and maybe even making some money. So keep checking into the site, subscribe to the site or to the podcast or both, and of course let me know what you think. There has been an encouraging amount of traffic and feedback recently, so please keep it coming and tell your friends. The next episode is hopefully going to be on Chase Brandon, the former CIA entertainment liaison, so that should be a lot of fun. As always, you've been listening to ClandesTime and I am Tom Secker, so thank you for listening, tune in again soon, and until next time, take care.